Hey guys, welcome back to Learn Python the Hard Way. In this exercise, we're going to focus on names, variables, code, and functions. So in this chapter, we're going to learn about functions. And that's one very important aspect that we're going to use over and over again, especially as we progress to the more advanced exercises. So functions do three things. First of all, they name pieces of code. The variables name strings and numbers. They take arguments the way that the scripts in the previous exercises took argv as a command line argument. And then if we combine the first and the second, so that we name pieces of code the way we use with variables, and then of course we also provide arguments, then we can basically create our own mini scripts or tiny commands. And in order to create a function in Python, we need to use the word def in front of the name of the function that we want to use. So let's take a look at that, and let's get started with defining a couple of different functions. And to get started with that, as always, let's open our terminal, and we're going to open a new exercise file, a new Python file, and then basically follow along and define the different functions here, basically code or provide the code here in this example file. So I'm going to use Visual Studio Code by entering code space and then the name of the exercise, so exercise 18.py for Python. And this is going to open a new file in Visual Studio Code. Of course, you can use any other text editor if you prefer. So let's get started with a comment here on top. So now we're going to start out by typing out def, then the name of the function, which is called print2, and then in parentheses we're going to provide an argument, for example args, and then here we're going to use or define two new variables, arg1 and arg2, and we're going to assign args, so the argument that we take here, to those two variables. Then next we're going to use printf to be more precise, to print out arg1, and we provide the value of arg1 and then also arg2. And again, we use those curly braces to actually render the content of those variables here. Alright, and instead of doing that, we can adjust this a little bit. And we can directly enter arg1 and arg2 instead of providing args here with a star. And then we basically save one line of code. We can just go ahead and type out basically the second line of our function up here, so that we use printf to print out arg1 and arg2 with the respective values. Instead, we can also define a function that just takes one argument. In that case, of course, we would type out def followed by the name of the function, but now we just provide one argument. And again, we're using printf to print out the content of arg1 here. And we can even go ahead and define a new function that takes no arguments at all, in which case we would just enter nothing in between those parentheses, and then we can just print out, in this case, just a regular print statement here. I got nothing. Alright, so once we defined those different functions, those four different functions, we can now go ahead and basically call those functions. First of all, print2, and we provide two arguments, that and show. Next we call the second function print2 again, and we can just use the auto-completion here to basically complete the name of the function. And again, we can provide the same input here. And of course, that should be exactly the same output, just reaching it in two different ways. Next, we're going to use print1 and print out one argument first, and finally print none. All right, so let's save that real quick. And just to follow along with the instructions here, when we take a look at the first function, print2, the one up here, what we do is we first of all use the keyword def for define, to define a new function. Then we provide a name for the function, so in this case print_2. And it doesn't really matter what we call the function. It's just important that we, of course, remember the name, and that we, when we want to call the function, that we actually provide and type out that name later on. Then we tell it what we want, so we provide the arguments, in this case star args, asterisk args, which is a lot like argv, which we saw in the previous exercise, which we used to actually provide some command line arguments when we executed our code. And of course we have to enter that in the parentheses here after the name of the function. Finally, we add a colon here at the very end, and then we start indenting to make sure that we are actually within the function that we define. And then anything that's in this indented area here would then actually be part of that function. And typically when we indent, we would use 4 spaces. So I'm using tab here, but tab is bound in my case to 2 spaces. So here we would make sure that we use 4 spaces instead of using tabs, which are bound to 2 spaces. We can also just press space 4 times. That will basically do the same here, and that will be properly indented. All right, and the problem with print2 is that it's not the easiest way to make a function. We can basically skip the step here, this line here, where we actually unpack that argument here and then assign it to different variables. Instead, what we can do is we can use the function print_2_again and directly provide the arguments here. So we basically save one line. And then, of course, instead of providing 2 arguments, we can define a function with just 1 argument, or even one without any argument. And then we would not provide any value here when we call it. It will just always print out the same information here. All right, so let's continue and actually execute this. If we open our terminal again, we can now type out Python 3 or Python 3.6, followed by the name of the Python file. So in this case, exercise18.py. And if we press enter, this is what we see, and this is the same output as here in the exercise book. So argument 1 here, this is basically the output of print_2, would be arg1 colon, and then the value for arg1, which is z in this case, and then arg2, and this is the second value we provided, sure. And as we can see, the second line is exactly the same. This is what's printed out because of print_2_again. And the difference is just the implementation. So in the first case here, we entered star args, and then we bound whatever we provided here to those 2 variables and then printed it out. And in the second function, we just skipped the middle step. We directly entered the final arguments here, and then we can print it out in 1 line. Next, we have print1 first, which is the third function here. And this is just printing out arg1 colon, and then the value for arg1, which in this case is first. So this is why we get arg1 colon first exclamation mark. And then at the very end, we have print none, which is basically always the same statement here, no matter what we provide, because we basically don't provide any argument here. So it would always be I got nothing. All right, so that's basically how functions work. And in the previous exercises, we already used functions when we, for example, used commands like exists or open. And those are also functions which we didn't write ourselves, but which were provided through Python or through any modules that we imported and that were made available to us. All right, so that's the exercise. Let's take a look at the study drills section. So what we should do is we should create a function checklist for later exercises, just to make sure that we properly define functions. So we can write that on an index card and then keep it with us, so it's handy if we want to write any additional functions going forward. We always should start with the def keyword first in the beginning. That's the first step. Then we should make sure that we provide the correct name. The name of the function should only have characters, like print, for example, and the underscore character, for example, here print _2. We need to make sure that we, after the name, enter open parentheses, that we put the arguments inside, for example, arg1, arg2, that each argument is unique, so that we don't have duplicated names. For example, we shouldn't be doing this here, arg1, arg1, because then it could also get a bit confusing. After that, after we provide the arguments, we need to, of course, close the parentheses here and add a colon after that. After we've done that, after we entered the first line here, we would then, in the next line, enter 4 spaces, no more, no less. That's basically the standard way of doing that in Python. It would technically work if we provide fewer spaces, but that's basically the standard way of approaching that. And then we would end our function, quote unquote, by basically going back to not indenting the line. So we can see here we indented the first and second line here after the def print _2 definition of the function. And then in the next line here, basically we didn't indent it anymore, and this basically then ends the function definition. All right, so that's how we define a new function. In order to run or use or call our function, we need to check the following things. We first of all need to enter the name of a function by typing the name correctly. So here, for example, we have print2 to actually call that function. Here we would not use the def word in front, but just the name of the function itself. Then after that, we add an open parentheses. We enter the values, so the arguments that we want to basically pass to the function, which would then be connected to the appropriate words here. So for example, that would be connected to arg1 and Shaw would be connected to arg2. We need to also make sure to separate those values with a comma. And then finally, of course, we need to close the parentheses here. All right, so that's the 2 important checklists, which ideally we should write down. First section here covering how we define a new function, that's up here. And then the second checklist covering how to basically call the function or how to run the function. And finally, let's repeat this to ourselves. To run, call, or use a function, that's basically all means the same thing. So here, what we do here at the end, this is the way to call a function, to run a function, or to use a function. It all means the same thing. And finally, let's take a look at some common student questions. What's allowed for function name? That's basically the same as a variable name. Anything that doesn't start with a number and is letters, numbers, and underscores will work. So what we are not allowed to do is the following. To start the variable name with a 1, it already turns red. What we could do is we could start with a letter, for example, and then maybe an underscore, and after that we can add a number. But it can't be at the very beginning. That would not be valid. What does a asterisk in asterisk args do? That tells Python to take all the arguments to the function and then put them in args as a list. So that's what we did up here. We provided as a value here asterisk args, And then as we call the function, we provided those two arguments here. And that's like argv, which we used before to provide some command line arguments that we've been using before, but in this case it's for functions. And it's not normally used too often unless specifically needed. So if we, for example, don't know how many arguments would be provided, that would be a typical example when we're actually working with that. If that's clear how many arguments we have, as in this case here, we would just directly provide the arguments themselves, and then we can again skip that one line. All right, this feels really boring and monotonous. That's good. It means you're starting to get better at typing in the code and understanding what it does. To make it less boring, take everything I tell you to type in and then break it on purpose. All right, so it's always good to experiment and to make some changes here. All right, and that's it for exercise 18. See you guys in the next video where we take a look at exercise 19.